you guys for being here, and thank you to the Community Home Trust for having this, and hopefully at the end of all this, we'll focus a little bit on what the Community Home Trust does, so we can connect the dots. But Congressman Price and I are going to have a pretty informal discussion about affordable housing. It'll be largely a federal policy, federal problem kind of discussion, just because that's what we know more about, I think. So our backgrounds lend themselves a little more to that kind of discussion in the local version. But we'll talk a little bit about the history of the issue, which David can speak to, the nature of the policy challenge, how the politics of the issue have shifted over time, what they're like now, and then what we might expect going forward. I think if who's there and you're all that confident about what's going to happen policy-wise in the next few years, but we can speculate a little bit. And then at the end, we're going to open up a Q&A. So if you've got questions, just hold it for a little bit. We'll probably talk for half an hour plus or minus, and then make it a more inclusive discussion. Yeah. So with that in mind, Dave, do you want to start us off with maybe some background on the challenge? It goes back decades, even if many of us have only been focusing on it the last few years, but you've been struggling with it for a long time.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see everybody, and nice to be with the Community Home Trust and to see a nice crowd, and to be able to visit with you once again. Jim says correctly that we're going to be probably tilted toward the federal side, just given our experience and what we have worked most with. But there's no question that given the election outcome and what we're facing now at the federal level, that whether we like it or not, this is going to be an arena for state and local initiatives, and that is what we're going to depend on much more than any kind of reliable housing thrust from the administration. That I'll say a little bit about our experience from the first Trump term, but I expect with Elon Musk doing his magic and all kinds of things we're going to be faced with, that you're not going to be seeing major investments here. But I don't want to jump the gun out. Let's begin a little more fundamentally. Just remind ourselves that this is an issue that the federal government has addressed only since after World War II, and the need across the economic spectrum has only gotten greater. Used to think of this as a problem of low-income renters, which public housing was designed to address that. But there's always been a challenge of home ownership, which the government has subsidized or encouraged in various ways. And there's always been a broad array of housing needs and housing programs to fit those needs. So just to remind ourselves, the spectrum runs from public housing, which we are not and haven't for a long time been adding to, where it's a struggle just to keep public housing in good repair. But that is where the cutting edge of housing expansion has been for a long time. But then up the scale, you have assistance to renters through vouchers, the Section 8 program, and specialty programs addressing veterans and other special populations. And you have some programs that are focused on special populations that where the housing needs have been great, and where nonprofits and other organizations have been willing to be part of the solution. We've had for a long time the 202 so-called elderly housing program. We've had the 811 housing program for people with disabilities. 202 is particularly visible in this community. Manny Estates is a 202 development. Covenant Place is a 202 development. Lots of congregations in the good old days did these elderly housing projects. One of my goals in the Congress was to get that program rejuvenated. Another kind of specialized federal program is the old Hope 6 program, now called Choice Neighborhoods, where you're redeveloping whole neighborhoods, whole communities in a comprehensive way. That's a unique item in the federal portfolio. And then you have flexible housing funding through the home program, which it has both rental and home ownership aspects, and the CDBG, so-called Community Development Block Grants, which have support infrastructure and often complement private housing or nonprofit housing efforts like Habitat for Humanity, for example. Their lobbying list these days not includes CDBG, because in so many communities the infrastructure for habitat neighborhoods has been furnished through that program. So all of this is to say that the array of housing needs is great. It is also varied. One size does not fit all. And I would dare say every one of these programs is currently underfunded. That's my impression. And I can talk a little bit later about the kind of relative emphasis I tried as an appropriations chair to give to these various programs. But I would fundamentally argue for all of them, for exactly the kind of variety and flexibility that they give us. The challenge is just where do we go from here with the needs so great, with only 1 out of 4 families who should have housing assistance of some sort, only 1 out of 4 getting it, with enormous numbers of our fellow citizens paying 60–70% of their income in rent. Oh, you know, how did we get here? How do we begin to get where we need to be in terms of housing being an issue that we address right up there with healthcare and education. It often doesn't get that level of attention, but is equally important to human well-being, and I think it deserves equal emphasis.
So what Dave just said could have been said, I would argue, anytime in the last 20 years. Roughly what you said is true of the policy and market gap that we had at the bottom of the income spectrum, especially rental housing, for decades. What's changed in recent years, and what's made the politics of this change quite a bit in the last 2 years in particular, is the market failure has crept way up the income spectrum, need spectrum. So we've gone from a market law that's left a very vulnerable segment of the population with excessive housing costs that they can't afford, a ditch we've been in for decades, to becoming a flaw that is underserving a much larger segment of the population than it used to. So it's not that we're underserving the bottom 10% of the economic spectrum anymore. Now in housing, at least, it's more like the bottom 35%. And what's happened is, to understand why this shift has happened, why you got this expansion of the problem, you got to go back about 15 years or so. In the great financial crisis, the construction industry all but collapsed, along with a lot of it. And with demand collapsing, the business model all but collapsed, and a lot of folks picked up their stakes and went home, as it were. And it took several years for the industry to sort of get back on its feet. And even once it got back on its feet, so fast forward into 2010, 11, 12, 13, they were really only positioned to serve the top of the market, because that's where the margin was greatest, right? So they're building houses for wealthy folks because they could, get a 30% margin, and that was enough to cover the risk and cost of sort of setting back up. It took until 2018, 19, 20 for the construction industry nationwide to begin to build housing more into the middle of the market. But really, even then, it was the top part of the middle of the market. So we're talking at this point, the top half of the rental and market for purchase has finally begun to be well served again. But they still haven't gotten to the bottom half of the market. We're not talking the folks that David was just mentioning. We're talking that bottom half of the country as far as this demand goes. And so going back 15 or so years, supply has fallen short of demand by over 100,000 units a year across rental and commercial. So we're over between 2 and 3 million units short nationwide between rental and homeownership, and all that's concentrated at the bottom of the market. And it's very lumpy. Some communities are much worse off than others. And that disconnect between supply and demand is what's driven up home prices, to such a stratospheric sort of level. It's what's driven up rents. And until you get back to some equilibrium, it's not going to slow down. That part of inflation is not going to go back down the way that other assets have gone back down. Rents are going to keep going up. Home prices are going to keep going up just because there are not enough homes for those that need to buy or rent. And the main reason, without getting too far into the weeds, is the fixed costs of building homes to rent or to buy are so high that if you're a builder, in most communities, not true in all communities, but in most communities, you can't begin to make a profit until you get to the top half of the market. Because if you're trying to serve the bottom half of the market, fixed costs exceed what you could possibly sell a home for. So not surprisingly, that's not what people are buying or building. Not building it to rent or to own. Again, not in all communities, but in most communities. And so there's this basic economic problem. It is being driven by high labor costs, high materials costs, namely, are the biggest variables. Cost of land, which is driven in large part by exclusive zoning. So a lot of communities have local rules that make it hard to build in the areas where density, where you need it most, which is driving up the cost of land. It's pulling supply off the market that might have been there, that might have built on. All of that's leading to this upward pressure on fixed costs, which is making it the supply challenge worse and worse each year. And so that's what's turned it into this intractable bottom 10% problem that it's hard to get Congress to focus on. Not all of Congress, but a lot of Congress to focus on. It's not a mainstream kind of problem. And it's turned it into a pretty mainstream problem, because now it's a problem not just for the bottom 10%, but for the bottom like 40%. And that's changed really how the issue is being discussed. It's why it was in the presidential campaign for the first time in forever. It's why it's making its way into state media addresses and things, places that we haven't seen it before. Do you know about the politics of this and how that's shifted a little bit in recent years?
This has been a local issue for a long time, but there too the intensity is much greater now. I mean, the mayor's races in this town, where are we, Carver or Chapel Hill, either one, take your pick. Durham, Raleigh, affordable housing has been very near the top of the list. Major bond issues have usually passed. There is a new relevance of this issue, I think, at the local level, and obviously questions being asked about where is the federal support? What does that look like? And can it be anything like it at a level that it needs to be? Jim talks about the supply side of this as the analytically that's where the greatest problem lies. That isn't necessarily the sexiest policy proposal. I had an experience with this, which he knows about, with the so-called Build Back Better plan, which was the big Biden economic plan, which a lot of which got enacted, but unfortunately the housing piece did not, by and large, get enacted. But had a major quarrel with the Maxine Waters, I'll name names, the chair of the Financial Services Committee in the House, who's when she was asked to produce a piece of the Build Back Better plan, basically came up with just millions of vouchers, which of course looked good, sounded good, but no attention whatsoever to the supply side of the equation. I don't even know that they proposed any tax credits, which is kind of the most fundamental way to address the supply question. But anyway, I was appropriations chairman, was not, in my opinion, fully consulted on how this got put together. So we had some interesting byplay. I remember phone calls from a trip I had taken trying to work this out. But it all was for mostly was for naught because the Build Back Better housing component never got enacted. We did beef up the annual appropriations bills. I'll just briefly indicate what I tried to do there. It was partly a sense of where the opportunities were, where there could be political appeal, and also a sense of where the need was. My committee did not have the jurisdiction over tax credits. I think tax credits are a hugely important piece of this. And they also have the advantage of having more bipartisan buy-in than spending proposals do. So, but that was not I was not chair of that committee. I was chair of the spending committee, and I tried to bring back programs that had declined very precipitously, including during the Obama years. I don't think a lot of these things got the attention they should have for a long time. But I thought the 202 elderly housing was a good program. It addressed a real need, and it also had political appeal in that it engaged local congregations, local nonprofits. Everybody loves housing for the elderly. I thought that a lot of money ought to be greater, and people ought to be able to compete for it and get that going again. Did the same with housing for the disabled, which is a huge need. There's a division there between the group home type approach and the mainstreaming of people with disabilities. We need to do both, but both take a lot of money. The one I feel like I can claim credit for really bringing back to life was Choice Neighborhoods. That was really, we were down to doing 3 or 4 projects nationwide in a year. It virtually withered away, and so we did get Choice Neighborhoods built back year after year. So I'll say a little bit about the Trump time.
No, not yet.
We'll wait on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, over the period that I was in leadership, we were able to get those programs back into more robust shape, and at the same time, we were able to apply successfully for some of those funds from here, which, of course, from the standpoint of a representative, is the main idea.
So on the politics of this, they track the change in the politics of this tracks roughly the spread of the need that I mentioned before. So if you go back two years, roughly, year and a half, housing polled as a top 10 issue of concern, but not really top 5, which is kind of where it always has been, which is why it's hard to get anything big done, because the administration, whatever administration is, tends to focus on 3 or 4 things at a time. It can't quite do 8, so it never would break into the upper tier. But so it was top 10, not top 5, and then it began to sort of move up the charts, as it were, beginning about 18 months ago, and it became a top sort of 8 to 5 sort of issue, and the Biden folks began to get a little concerned that it was the level of angst that likely voters were expressing about housing was becoming a problem or an area of concern for them. And so it kept going up as they were beginning to think about the State of the Union. So this time goes back a year, and so they the political folks began to ask the policy folks for big ideas that were aggressive enough to meet the level of angst that voters were expressing. And so the policy folks, I got pulled in all this, which only I know about all this polling. This is all internal, like White House kind of polling. And so the policy folks began to scramble for ideas that would feel big that he could then mention the same union. And so a bunch of us helped them think this through, and we came up with a pretty aggressive supply side package. And because, as we mentioned, that's the nature of the problem, not so much a demand side issue. And so the policy people were all proud, and they said, well, we're pretty sure we can deal with the problem with X, Y, and Z. policy tools, and the political people, you know, their jaws dropped and said, no, you don't understand the nature of the problem. I said, well, what's wrong? They went to sort of page 2 of the polling deck. And if you look at the people that by that point were ranking housing like 3 behind inflation and the second one was, but it's way up there at this point. It's now heading into the drafting of the State of the Union. That if you went to the page 2 or whatnot of the polling stuff, when they talked to those who had listed housing as a top 3 problem, and they asked them, do you want more homes built in your communities? Half of them said, no. We don't want any more buildings in our communities. We want our community just like it is now. I just want to be able to afford my neighbor's house, which I can't afford that. So there's this disconnect between the perception that those that were ticked off about this and the sort of economic, reality the policy guys were stuck in. And so the policy guys, you can tell the political guys, well, what do you want us to do? Like, there's no magic wand that's going to override like economic physics, as it were. And so that led to a somewhat muddled. They did lean into the State of the Union, but it was a muddled, lot of demand side, supply side stuff you might not remember, sort of thing where he was able to express, concern about it in a way that largely didn't break through to folks. If you ask people on the street 4 days later, does Biden care about housing? They would say yes, absolutely. And what is he going to do? And they would say, I don't quite recall. So then fast forward another few months, whatever it was from January to June, whenever Harris got in. And at that point, inflation began to fall as an area of concern because other asset prices were coming down. And housing was like number 2 at that point. It was all the way almost at the top of the list. And Harris folks also, like the Biden folks before them, realized they had a problem on their hands and needed to really lean into this. And they, to their credit, learned from the mistake of the guys drafting the State of the Union and realized they needed something to break through. And to their credit, they went pretty big on the supply side. They trusted or hoped that if they leaned in on the supply side, eventually those that care about housing issue would appreciate what they were trying to do and overcome their angst about having more stuff built in their communities. But that tracking of where the polling was taking housing, or housing was taking polling, tells you a lot about the way in which it became a campaign issue, the reason why senators and congressmen are taking it up, as a more sort of part of their talking points. More of them have proposals out there than they've ever had before. And so it feels like it's more in the ether now than it's ever been. Again, because it's gone from being a bottom 10% issue to a bottom 45% issue. And that makes it a pretty mainstream political issue that both sides felt the need to struggle with. Harris struggled with it in the way that I mentioned is largely beside the point at this point. Trump had a very Trumpian way to address it or talk about it, which I guess segues us into the.
You may have picked that up, and I didn't. I mean, what did he actually say?
Oh, geez. Okay, so he had it was a fluid position, but so he didn't have hasn't had, doesn't have didn't have I don't know. That's his fluid. It changes. He hasn't had a housing platform per se. That is, whereas he's got he's got a sheriff platform. He's got other platforms that have bullets and things like traditional folks have. Housing, not so much. But when he talks about housing, he tends to talk about 2 or 3 things. The first that he goes to is mass deportation. He says over and over again that if I get rid of the 10 million, 15, 20 million, depends on the speech, number of things that be here, shouldn't be here, it's in the home, then the demand for housing will go down and home prices will go down. And, so that's one. I'll come back to that in a second. 2, deregulation. There's a huge chunk of the cost of housing that comes from regulation. I'm going to deregulate the cost of building. That's number 2. And then number 3, and of the 3, this is the one that actually has some salience, and maybe it goes somewhere, but it could be useful. There's a fair amount of federal land that is underutilized where one could build affordable housing. Biden actually has pushed much the same thing. They talk about it very differently. Trump talked about it in a very grand way, as if we're going to have Section 8, large projects of like Yosemite or whatever, they can probably. But if you narrow it a little bit, there are a fair number of federal buildings that are underutilized. You can imagine some solutions. But quickly on the first 2 points, and then we'll talk about what you think holistically of Trump. It's worth noting, not to get too much into the immigration debate, do that for a different organization or a different night, but depending on what state you live in, somewhere between 25 and 45% of construction labor comes from exactly that group. In California and Texas, Florida, it's 45 to 50% of the labor force comes from the very immigrants he's talking about. And if you break down the parts of the construction group, whether it's folks that make the roofs, folks that put in the floors, some of the subsets of folks that you need to get something up, it's like 70% of those are coming from this group. So the damage, if you somehow magically made 15 million of these folks disappear, you'd have a gigantic supply chain problem that lasts for a decade and utterly screw up the supply dynamic even more going forward for a long time. And on the deregulation point, it is true that a very large portion of the cost of building comes from complying with various regulations, but like 80% of it is local regulations. It's local constraints that are put into building. And he's been very careful. He's not going to screw around with local decision making because it's a bit of a dog whistle to suburbia that I'm not going to high rises in British Connecticut or whatnot. So he's not talking about those regulations. He's talking about federal regulations. And even if you made the federal regulations all disappear, you're talking about a very tiny slice cost. So it's a bit of a BS sort of bait and switch. Anyway, so that's kind of what he said in the campaign, relevant. May or may not be. But where do you think we're headed with him?
Well, just quickly, let me say a bit about first Trump term and the kind of proposals that came to us, which were very, very, very minimal kind of constructive proposals. I may have overlooked, but it was hard over. There wasn't much of a housing component to the Trump program, and their budgets spoke volumes. I mean, the budgets basically lowballed funding drastically and actually zeroed out. I think they zeroed out choice neighborhoods completely. They zeroed out home, zeroed out community development block grants. I mean, these things which have a strong bipartisan support or have had historically. The Trump budgets were just devastating in terms of the kind of and the kind of programs we have depended on and that we assumed had broad support. The Congress tended to put those back, not necessarily restore the former levels, but there were Republicans as well as Democratic members who didn't go along with this and who wanted to maintain these funding streams that their communities had depended on. So I was at that point I was ranking member and then chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee, and so I was dealing with Ben Carson, who was HUD secretary, and by custom, the chair and the secretary sit down usually in his office for lunch 2 or 3 times a year just to talk about the budget matters and the upcoming deliberations. And so I found those meetings pretty awkward. They were kind of hard to find things to talk about. But I did have this idea, knowing that Ben Carson's religious background, a strong religious inclination. I thought, well, now, what would it be like for this administration as a signature issue to get that elderly housing back in business and to engage congregations across this country once again in providing elderly housing and to, in other words, to have as a kind of policy hallmark a faith-based outlet. So guess how far that got? No response whatsoever. And I would say that during those years, sometimes under Republican control, sometimes under Democratic control, during those years, the housing was kind of a holding operation at best. When I had a chance to do more, as I said at the beginning, I did plus up those programs. Plus created a special funding line, which Chapel Hill has now applied for, hope successfully. I created a special funding line for manufactured housing communities to restore, rehabilitate, promote tenant ownership. Very flexible things that you might do to resist developmental pressures and maintain quality, affordable housing of that kind. I would think what we'll get out of the Trump administration in this area is going to be minimal. It's there. Jim talked about the signals he sent. None of that portends major investments in housing, and I think the initiative is going to fall where it's always been. I mean, housing. No matter how strong the federal emphasis has been, as it's waxed and waned over the years, housing has remained an area of local initiative, and it's been a matter of locals doing the work and seeking the federal support. That's the way it has worked, and certainly it's the way it's going to work, I think, in this period just ahead.
So let me give you at least and then we'll open up for discussion, but a bit of a silver lining, possibly not from the Trump administration, but from Congress. I do think that there are a couple of reasons to think that we may see some movement at the federal level in the next 2 years. One, as I mentioned, politics of this are different than they've ever been. So the stress that it's causing is not a coastal thing uniquely. It's almost ubiquitous across the country. So it's happening in blue states, red states, all the rest. So that is helpful politically in some sense. And then the other thing well, three things. The second thing that is helpful is the solutions to the bigger problems, not so much the stuff that Dave just mentioned, but the bigger math problem with the serving bottom third of the market, 40% market. Tax side solutions are probably the answer, and tax side solutions tend to be an easier sell for Republicans than spending solutions, like straight spending solutions, appropriations. So if your solution to a problem is lowering the tax rate for a certain industry to go and solve your policy problem, that tends to find more bipartisan interest than giving HUD more money to give to philanthropies or to spend on their own. So that's a good thing here in this context. And then the third thing is the biggest thing we will have going on as far as policy making goes, at least domestic policy next year, is the renegotiation of the expiration of Trump's tax credits. It is a gigantic undertaking because they expire at the end of next year. And Congress is not going to want to let them expire. And there's just an enormous amount at stake for them to get that over the finish line. And so that means they're going to be mucking around on the tax code for 6 months next year, trying to figure out how to make the math work in some sense. And so it won't take much to get tax related issues, at least in the discussion. And so there's a kind of a fortunate confluence of factors here that may get some housing related tax pieces into the debate in a way that would have seemed unlikely in other versions of a Trump kind of administration. So Trump won't push this, it's not his thing. But I can imagine some members of Congress making it something they sort of demand in order to get their yes vote. So I can imagine this LIHTC is a rental program that has a lot of industry support. I can imagine something like that getting some traction in an environment in which the sums we'll be talking about will be absolutely staggering. And where even if you can get a small portion carved out for housing, it may get lost in the dust of larger discussions that mean a lot on the housing side. So there's that cause for at least modest optimism. And then adding to that, there's a downside to this. I don't foresee a lot of fiscal restraint coming out of this next Congress. I think if Harris had won, there would have been a big pushback against deficit spending. Because, you know, the Lindsey Grahams of the world would have, you know, gotten all high and mighty about deficit spending. They will say bupkis in the next Congress when Trump wants to extend tax credits or tax cuts, deepen tax cuts and all that. You will get very little pushback from those that normally care about this. And so my guess is there will be little constraint on the sheer volume of tax cuts we're talking about, which again opens the aperture a little bit for housing related movement, I think.
Yeah, as we turn to your questions, I totally agree on the tax question. That's the potential opening. If I were advising housing advocates, I would say prepare right now to make a strong case for generous affordable housing tax credits. And I can tell you, in this state, we have a housing finance agency that is very skilled, I think, and aggressive in taking advantage of these. My advice would be to proceed on that front as the main emphasis. I think that there's going to be an interesting conflict. You talk about the spending and a lot of the budget hawks. If it's Republicans doing the spending, they fall silent. This Elon Musk thing, though, that, you know, I mean, very, very extravagant promises as to how much budgets are going to be cut. I don't know how that's going to work. I mean, you would predict a great deal of conflict and confusion and chaos over superimposing Musk's operation, whatever level he's going to operate or whatever portion of the process he's going to be given control over. I mean, it's just a disaster waiting to happen. The conflict with the budget, the regular budget machinery and the appropriations machinery in the Congress. You don't superimpose lightly on those processes. So,
but yeah, you got a fundamental math problem, right? So Trump has already said Social Security is off the table, Medicare and Medicaid off the table. So when you take that stuff off the table, you've got crumbs left. And so Elon can make all the crumbs disappear, which is terrible, but it's still crumbs relative to the grand.
Well, it's not $2 trillion. I mean, the whole domestic budget is far less than that.
Okay, so that may have been too wonky in the weeds and too federal for everybody's taste. But there we are. So questions, and it is worth mentioning what was implicit in what a lot of what we said and what they've made explicit. It does feel like the heavy lifting is going to come to the local level, which is sort of why we're here. It does not seem like we're in a window in which the federal policymakers are going to step up in a dramatic way. So it really does fall to local organizations like Community Home Trust to carry the water to deal with this mess that we're in, which is why we're here. And that's not just too cute by halfway to connect the dots for the setting we're here for. I think it's true. But with all that as context, questions, comments, sure, in the back.
Use the mic.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Good evening, I'm Megan Jarrett, I'm Commissioner for the town of Hillsborough. And one of the topics that I didn't hear covered was about the infrastructure. One of the issues that Hillsborough has is our infrastructure. And we could, you know, reduce so many different things, pull so many levers, but that's one that is really a sticking point for us.
Yeah.
Something you could add to that.
Yeah, so what's a challenge about that? What's a challenge about that is that's not a tax side thing, that's a spending side thing. I helped Harris put together her housing package And there was a giant sum in there, that was meant to be, pushed out to communities basically to cover this issue. And the way we thought about it, developing this was, you've got, there are two, very broadly speaking, oversimplified things. There are two categories of ways the federal government can help communities solve the problem at the community level. One is nudging them to be better about their zoning decisions. And frankly, there's a fight in the democratic world of carrots or sticks. You know, folks have gone with carrots forever, but you know, a lot of folks are advocating for sticks. And we can talk about that too if you like. We'll have no sticks in the next 4 years, so it's a longer term discussion. But then the other part was there are a lot of communities, which you just suggested, that are actually in the right place on zoning. That is, they would like to make the right moves, but it's expensive. It's not just about saying yes to certain kinds of development. It's about putting in place infrastructure that allows that kind of development to happen in a way that's not problematic, whether it's sewer, roads, whatever. And so Harris proposed a $40 billion fund that was intended to probably go to help that set of communities, probably more than those that were on the fence, who probably would stay on the fence no matter how much you walk with them. In the world that we're now in, as of last week, I don't see this administration tackling it that way, and I don't see Congress, because it's a spending side, appropriation side problem. It's hard for me to see a world in which Congress is willing to step up and spend a lot of money to help on that front. So I don't see the cavalry coming in to help on the federal side soon on that. I mean, I'd love to give a better, hopeful answer, but I'm not sure. I can't come up with it.
And there is of course the Biden infrastructure initiatives.
That's true. There's money.
There's some money that has been authorized, and it's above and beyond the normal appropriations process. That money has not been obligated though, by and large. I mean, it's not that they didn't try. I mean, they really did try to move the money out the door to have. We did this here, a lot of local announcements about various infrastructure projects just to serve notice that this was happening. But there's a lot of that money in the pipeline still, and I don't know. It's going to be very tempting for Musk and company to just resume those funds.
Yeah, they're racing to get that money out. They really are trying to get, because there's a difference. So he is right. So we're going into pay for land here with the tax negotiations, and they're going to look for any which way they can to cover what they would like to spend with the tax cuts. And so they will absolutely claw back everything they can from what Biden's passed. And so what the Biden folks are trying to do is get as much of this money out the door as possible, because once it's out the door committed, legally it's very hard to be clawed back. But there are just limits that the pipelines in place to get the money out are much narrower than the flow of money that's available to go through. And so whatever's not out by January 20th or whatever the date is, they're, you know, whether it's Elon Musk or somebody else, that they'll hit pause and that money probably won't make it where it's supposed to go. Other questions?
I was surprised to hear you say that demand isn't seen as an issue right now, especially in terms of the impact of Airbnb and other things in regards to city living and the availability of homes. Is there any feasibility of looking at the impact of those kind of homes, as well as the third and fourth home purchases, just for investment?
Yes. So there are some communities in which institutional investors, the math in those in certain neighborhoods and certain communities is very appealing to certain institutional investors who've gone in big to buy up a lot of entry-level homes to then make them single-family rentals. Suburban Charlotte's gotten hit really hard with this. Austin, Texas got hit really hard with this. And when they go in, when the math works, it works. They don't buy one property. We're talking like Blackstone. They're not going to buy one. They're going to buy hundreds, or thousands in certain areas. So when they go in big because the math works. And for one block, it's going to work for a whole neighborhood. The market has shifted a little bit recently, and there's not quite as much of that going on as there was maybe 2 years ago when rates were a little lower. But that does pose a bit of a structural problem. And my take on it is there's a pretty significant tax benefit the institutional investors get from doing this that seems a little ridiculous. I mean, some of these institutional investors actually build supply, and so they're helping. But some don't. They just go in and buy up what aspiring home buyers would have bought. And because they're able to use lower cost of capital than what you and I would have, and they've got tax advantages that you and I wouldn't have, it strikes me as a silly way to unlevel the playing field. Like, there's no reason for us as a country to decide to actually help those folks buy up, the stuff, maybe not impede them, but there's no reason to help them. And so one of the things that Harris had proposed was to remove some of the tax advantages from all this. There too, it's hard for me to see how that changes. That's a federal thing, and it's just hard to see how this next Congress is going to take that on. But that could change if the Blackstones of the world, I use it as a boogie, I don't mean to, but if the institutional investors, once the market comes back, rates come back down again, it makes more sense for them to go in their communities. There's a world in which they push the wrong community too far, and this is off the wrong congressional, coalition of Republicans, and suddenly they've got a problem on their hands. We're pretty far from that at this point. So in that sense, there is a demand problem that you've got an unfair source of demand that's screwing up the market even more than the supply we've got. So I take your point.
I don't want this question to be too wonky, but I'm curious about how I think we all know that Trump's impending corporate tax cuts will affect the pricing of tax LIHTC, as it did when he did his last tax cuts. And that'll significantly affect the financial feasibility of committed affordable housing. I'm curious if there are any ways we can sort of mitigate that effect.
Yeah, so without going too far in the weeds to explain that, which is totally the right point. When the corporate tax rate drops, the value of the tax credits that we use to incentivize folks to actually build affordable housing goes down. They're just less useful to companies because they don't have to pay the tax burden. So as tax rates go up, these tax credits get more valuable, and so people use them. So as they go down, the reverse happens. That's what happened with Trump's tax cuts last time around, and would happen again if you drop the corporate rate as he's suggesting you would. There are other ways in which you can fiddle with the math of LIHTC that can affect that a little bit. So the way LIHTC works is in order to get credits, you've got to have a certain amount of public financing, for instance. One of the things a lot of us who've been involved in this have talked about is lowering that requirement. If you lower the requirement, then the math works for developers a little more quickly. So you can counteract the devaluation of the tax credits by changing the requirements that trigger your ability to get tax credits. But LIHTC's not that complicated. There are only a few levers you can fiddle with, so you kind of have to go to the other 2 or 3 levers. Whether or not we're in an environment in which people care enough about LIHTC to do that, it's hard to know. There are other tools too, opportunity zones or another area where you can play around with tax incentives to help. But again, there too, if you're lowering the overall tax credit or tax rate for corporations, it's taking a little juice out of this incentive structure, which is, you've only got to find a number of tools to counteract. But there are tools there. You just got to care enough about it.
How you doing? I appreciate your comments and everything, but listening to you is very disheartening, First of all, you said, how did we get there? We got there many decades ago. And it started with redlining, gentrification, and all the things, and it was geared towards someone that looks like me. So this is why we're here. So when I hear people talk about affordability, which I am an affordable housing commissioner, which I argue all the time that it was never designed to be affordable for me, right? It was always set up against, even in neighborhoods, you know, and so when I hear everyone speak about their concerns, our concerns is where are we gonna go? Okay? Y'all creating all these policies and principles, laws, which we don't fit. Simply because it was designed against me. So how do we fix that? One of the things that I get tired of is y'all talking around how we all got here. We got here due to racism, classism. We can go down the line. So those folks that's in Congress, all of you need to change your ways. Y'all need to do what's right. That's all I'm saying, do what's right. Because it's never gonna get better as long as you make it for yourself and nobody else. It doesn't work like that. So the reason why everyone's suffering, because you made us suffer. So we definitely don't have nowhere to go, but now it's making it where y'all don't have anywhere to go. So until we actually look at how it started, why Blacks don't own homes, why Blacks don't, it was designed to keep us out. So until we actually have that conversation and be real about it, we're gonna keep being here. I don't worry about Donald Trump. I worry about mindsets. Because if I have a person that doesn't believe in me, I would never have an opportunity. Even with community home trust, half of my people can't even afford to live in community home trust. And it wasn't even set up for them to live there. Every time they apply, they can have good credit, all that stuff. They're still shot down because of the mindsets. So when are we gonna really tell the truth and shame the devil, right? And do what's right. Because I believe y'all can fix this. I do. I mean, it was never designed, it was never broken, actually. It was designed to do it exactly what it's doing. But what happened was other people done got affected now, so we're concerned. But we've been living like this. So I just hope one day, Chapel Hill, Carlboro, or anywhere else, folks want to live with us and open up their hearts and their doors and their land. Because that's what it's gonna take. It's not gonna take all these bureaucracy policies. It's gonna take humans recognizing that other people are humans too. And set up where we can all live together. And then we can probably work together and have the things that everybody's crying for, but we never had it. So I just, when I hear people talk this way, I feel excluded all the time. Exclusionary zoning, what do that mean? Inclusionary zoning, okay, they have terms, redlining, restricted covenant, all of these things were designed for me. So until we, really had that conversation, we just gonna keep having these meetings of nowhere, right? So, Mr. Price, just talk to your constituents and tell them to change their mindsets. Because half of them own homes. So if you're gonna take away from us, then we might have to come live with y'all, because we don't have nowhere to go. Okay, and that's my mindset. We gonna come on Donald's property, yours, or all these Congress decision makers who seems to think that we don't deserve housing. So that's all I gotta say.
But statement and historically accurate as to what was there from the beginning. Talked about the post-World War II federal entry into housing policy. It explicitly sanctioned redlining and further segregation, further discrimination, and furthered inequality. And there's just no question about that. I think the challenge, of course, is to not have that kind of bias going forward, but also explicitly to try to correct for the bias earlier. There was, you may remember, in the Biden program, there was a category of funding. I'll just put my name on it. I forget what it was called, but it was to basically right these ancient wrongs. And it never assumed the prominence that it should have. But I tell you, Durham, North Carolina would have been a very good candidate for some of those funds when you consider the way urban development went there, the destruction of the historic Black community and lots of lots of recompense that is called for. I also think that you're right about the local, the stubbornness of some local attitudes about zoning and about the kind of neighborhoods people want to live in and so forth. And that's a tough question. I mean, it's a tough question whether federal policy somehow can deal with that or disincentivize it or reward the opposite kinds of policies. It's not entirely just a federal issue. These attitudes are often very deep seated, and people who are otherwise liberal and enlightened have very self-protective attitudes about the neighborhoods and their housing. So you're of course absolutely right about that. And here too, we need to figure out how federal policy can exercise some leverage on this and shake some of this loose.
Well said. That to add to that a little bit, oftentimes when folks talk about what kind of investment housing we need now, they point back to coming out of World War II. Well, actually, they point back to that, and also right after the Depression, when FHA and a bunch of organizations were set up. But when we injected this enormous amount of federal resources, both in the 30s and in the 40s, we did it with a whole bunch of redlining and other things like redlining built into it. So the giant federal resources that went into the system to help on housing went almost exclusively to white folks. I mean, very intentionally. It wasn't like an accident. I mean, it was written into the law more or less that this giant slog of money would go to some folks and not others. And so you saw this acceleration in the homeownership gap coming out of that by race. And so right now, the roughly 78% of white folks own a home, and 42–43% of Blacks and Hispanics own a home. And that's one of the main drivers of the wealth gap between the two, because for generations, the middle class has built wealth through owning a home, not by owning stocks and whatnot. They built their wealth by paying down their mortgage over time and building equity in their house. And so the groups that have been excluded from that are not only excluded from owning their own home, they're also excluded from building wealth and being part of the class. So like it's all really related. It's problematic. And then on the zoning thing, this is part of where the carrots and sticks debate's been. It's very hard to get some communities to think differently about zoning. And I'll give you examples of sticks that have been thrown around. Will be really controversial. You wouldn't see them in the next 4 years for sure, but they may make on the radar at some point. There have been 2 times when the federal government, at least that I know of, maybe more, the federal government has decided that a nationwide policy issue was important, a nationwide policy issue that was being driven by local decision making was important enough for them to overcome. So in the 70s, during the oil embargo, Jimmy Carter wanted everybody to drive 55 miles an hour, not 60, 70, 80, whatever. And that's the speed limits are a state law thing, not a federal law thing. So he couldn't wave a magic wand and make everybody drive 55 miles an hour. So he threatened to withhold highway funding from any state that didn't drop at 55 miles an hour. And overnight, everybody went to 55 miles an hour, right? And then fast forward to the 80s, Reagan wanted to raise the drinking age to 21. That too is a state thing, it's not a federal thing. And he couldn't convince everybody to go to 21. And so once again, he threatened to withhold highway funding. And overnight, everybody at DC, which has no highways to worry about, went to 21 immediately. So, you know, they're tools in the toolbox to force localities' hands. It's just really controversial, and it's a break glass kind of thing. So, but we're not without tools. The federal government's not without tools to deal with some of this stuff. It's just, you gotta have a lot of backbone. You gotta have a lot of backbone.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about lowering construction costs, which is another big factor of rising home prices. And I'm curious particularly your thoughts about modular housing, where you build the house off-site.
Yeah.
Is that a possible future way to kind of lower the cost?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really hopeful like development, and it really accelerated during the pandemic because labor constraints were huge because the pandemic, everybody's stuck in their homes and scaling up building it was hard. So the construction industry as a whole saw a surge in demand because everybody wanted to get up and move during the pandemic, or those that had the means to did. But the supply chain was all gummed up 6 days from Sunday, and so a bunch of pretty large builders either invested in or built a modular home warehouses, construction facilities that were meant not to be mobile homes. Like I think of modular homes, and I think of like I was born in Kinston, and when I think of a mobile, the idea that would be the solution to our problems is a little like not what I would have imagined, but their version of modular homes are quite different. They look much more like a normal entry level home that just happens to have been built in the pieces of which just have to be built somewhere else, and you come on site and put it together. So I actually think there is hope for that. It probably is going to take a large, national, well-financed kind of builder to come up with a way to skin that cat in a way that is scalable. But the economics are such that there are a lot of pretty big outfits that are out there trying to do that. And if it works, then it helps at the entry level more than it does anywhere else because the fixed costs are so much lower if you can find a way to do it. Yeah, so I'm mildly optimistic of that. It feels very theoretical. I've been optimistic about it for long enough that I'm now wondering why. But it does feel like something, at least theoretically, has some promise to me.
All right, I think we're good to go with the Q&A portion. Thank you both so much.
That's right. My name is Linda Mahadja, and I am both a proud homeowner with Community Home Trust and a current member of the board. I wanted to take a moment to share how important this conversation has been in helping me understand how decisions made the federal level impact affordable housing here at the local level. It's become clearer than ever that supporting local affordable housing initiatives is crucial as our community continues to evolve. For me, CHT has been a lifeline. As a teacher and a single mother, owning a home was always a dream felt out of reach. But thanks to the support of CHT, not only did I find a place that I could call home, but I also found a partnership that ensures I don't have to bear the burden of unaffordable home repairs. This is the reality that many of us face. Home ownership, while a dream for many, can quickly become overwhelming without the proper resources and support. CHT offers multiple programs that help homeowners maintain their homes in a way that is permanently safe, permanently habitable, and permanently affordable. One of the most vital programs is the Dowling Home Maintenance Fund, which we are happy to announce is the focus of this Giving Tuesday. Along with 61 donors, CHT created this fund in honor of the retirement of Robert Dowling, CHT's longtime executive director. Thanks to the Dowling Home Maintenance Fund, homeowners like me are able to apply for a loan from the fund, which is provided at zero interest with no payments required. The loan is repaid only when the home is sold. This generous fund covers essential repairs that directly impact our health, safety, and overall quality of life. As repair costs continue to rise, for many of us, this fund can be the difference between maintaining a safe home or not. Repairs like plumbing, electrical issues, deck replacements, or even mold remediation could become financial burdens that prevent us from staying in the homes we've worked so hard for. The Dowling Home Maintenance Fund ensures that these necessary repairs are accessible with no repayments due until the home is sold. In 2024 alone, over $13,500 has been distributed to CHT homeowners for repairs, with the average cost of repairs being around $3,600. Some of the repairs funded this year have included removing dangerous tree limbs hanging over a CHT home that posed a threat during high wind storms, replacing handrails on the porch of an elderly CHT homeowner, and rebuilding a deck that was no longer safe but had been a treasured part of a family's home. This year, Our goal is to raise $15,000 for the Dowling Home Maintenance Fund. Thanks to the generosity of our supporters, we already have a $6,000 match, which is a wonderful start. But we need your help to reach our $15,000 goal. Every contribution makes a difference, no matter how small. If you are able to help, please text Dowling, that's DOWLING, to the number 44321 to support the Dowling Home Maintenance Fund and make a lasting impact on the lives of CHT homeowners. Thank you for your support and for helping us keep our homes permanently affordable, safe, and secure. Your generosity truly means the world to us here at the Community Home Trust.